Sir, keep your hands where I can see them.
For what?
You were circling the block. That's suspicious behavior.
That's called doing my job.
Well, your job is making neighbors nervous. I need your ID.
DEA, I'm in the middle of an active narcotics operation.
Oh, shit.
Good thing your body cam is capturing all of this. Perfect for the lawsuit.
Special Agent Marcus Johnson was standing on the sidewalk in front of a suspect's house at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, autumn leaves covering the ground around him. He was 36 years old, had been a Drug Enforcement Administration special agent for 11 years, and was wearing a casual green jacket over a black shirt while conducting routine surveillance in a quiet residential neighborhood. Marcus was holding his federal identification wallet open in one hand, clearly showing his gold DEA badge and photo credentials, while speaking with a local police officer who had just arrived at the location. The officer, a young white man who looked to be about 25 at most, had gotten out of his patrol car and immediately begun questioning Marcus's presence in the area in a way that set off alarms in the experienced agent's head. Marcus's operation was a months-long narcotics investigation targeting a drug distribution network operating across multiple cities. He had spent weeks building the case, coordinating with local law enforcement agencies, and that morning was conducting pre-operational surveillance before a planned warrant execution later that day. He had notified the local police department about the DEA operation per standard protocol, and had assumed any officer responding to the neighborhood would be aware of the federal agent's presence. But the officer standing before him, whose badge identified him as Officer Kyle Brennan, clearly hadn't received that memo or had chosen to ignore it. Brennan had arrived responding to a call from a neighbor reporting a suspicious black man lurking in the neighborhood, looking at houses, acting in ways the caller described as threatening. Marcus had heard that type of description countless times throughout his career. A black man existing in a predominantly white neighborhood was automatically suspicious in some residents' eyes, no matter how legitimate his business was. He had immediately identified himself as a federal DEA agent, had shown his credentials, and had explained he was conducting lawful surveillance operation. That should have been the end of the conversation. But Brennan wasn't letting it go. The young officer looked at Marcus's credentials with obvious skepticism, holding them in a way that was almost disrespectful, turning them from side to side as if looking for evidence of forgery. He said the identification looked suspicious, that people could buy fake badges online, and that he was going to need to verify Marcus's identity before letting him go. Marcus felt the familiar mixture of frustration and disbelief. He was a federal agent with over a decade of service, was conducting an official operation, and was being treated like a criminal by a rookie officer who clearly didn't know how to recognize legitimate federal credentials. Marcus said calmly that Brennan was welcome to call the local DEA office and verify his identity, that the number was on the credentials, and that his supervisor was expecting a routine check-in within the next hour anyway. Brennan didn't reach for his radio to make that call. Instead, he said Marcus was going to have to come with him to the station for proper identity verification. Marcus asked under what legal authority he was being detained. He hadn't committed a crime. He was on public property conducting lawful federal investigation. He had provided valid federal identification. What probable cause did Brennan possibly have to detain him? Brennan said Marcus was acting suspiciously, that he was in a residential neighborhood with no obvious reason, and that until his identity was verified, Brennan had authority to detain him for investigation. Marcus almost laughed at the irony. His reason for being in the neighborhood was literally to enforce federal law, but it was being characterized as suspicious activity. Marcus kept his hands visible and told Brennan he wasn't going anywhere without proper verification of who he was, that if Brennan refused to make a simple phone call to the DEA office, then Marcus would call himself and have his supervisor speak with Brennan directly. He slowly reached for the cell phone in his pocket, announcing each movement as he did because of how situations like this could escalate dangerously when officers were nervous or biased. Brennan immediately told Marcus to keep his hands where he could see them, that reaching for anything could be interpreted as threatening. Marcus froze, phone still in his pocket, and said in a clear, firm voice that he was a federal agent, that his credentials were genuine, and that Brennan was making a serious mistake by treating him as a criminal suspect. Brennan then did something that would transform an uncomfortable encounter into a legal nightmare for him and his department. He told Marcus to turn around and put his hands behind his back. Marcus asked if Brennan was really planning to arrest a federal DEA agent conducting official operation. Brennan said Marcus was refusing to cooperate with legitimate police investigation, was acting suspiciously, and that until his identity was verified in a way Brennan deemed satisfactory, he was going to be detained. Marcus said clearly aloud for anyone who might be listening, including Brennan's body camera, which he noticed was recording, that he was Special Agent Marcus Johnson of the DEA, that he was identifying himself and showing valid federal credentials, and that he was being illegally detained by an officer who refused to verify information that had been literally handed to him. Marcus decided not to physically resist, knowing resistance could be used to justify escalated force. He put his hands behind his back and allowed Brennan to place handcuffs on his wrists. As the metal closed, Marcus said this arrest constituted interference with federal operation, that it violated multiple federal statutes, and that Brennan's body camera was documenting every moment of catastrophic error in judgment. Brennan didn't seem concerned. He led Marcus to the patrol car, placing his hand on top of Marcus's head as he guided him into the back seat, exactly the standard procedure used for arrested criminals. Marcus sat there handcuffed, his federal ID wallet now in Brennan's possession, watching through the window as the young officer walked back to check the area where Marcus had been standing. Another car pulled onto the street, an unmarked black sedan. Two people got out, both clearly law enforcement by the way they moved and dressed. They were Marcus's partners in the surveillance operation, Special Agent David Chen and Special Agent Lisa Morrison, who had been positioned at a different location, but had come to check when Marcus didn't make his scheduled check-in. They immediately saw the patrol car, saw Marcus in the back seat, and their expressions changed from confusion to disbelief to anger in rapid succession. Chen approached Brennan with federal ID wallet already open, gold DEA badge gleaming in the morning sun. Chen identified himself as a federal DEA agent and asked why exactly Brennan had his fellow agent in handcuffs. Brennan said he was responding to a call about a suspicious person, that the man in the car claimed to be a federal agent, but Brennan needed to verify identity. Chen said he was verifying now that Marcus Johnson was indeed a DEA special agent with 11 years of service, that he was conducting an authorized federal operation, and that Brennan needed to release him immediately. Brennan hesitated, clearly realizing he had made a mistake, but not wanting to admit it. He said the man had been uncooperative and defensive. Chen asked how exactly. Marcus had been uncooperative by showing his federal credentials and offering a phone number for verification. Morrison joined the conversation, her voice low, but with contained anger. She said she and Chen were witnesses that Marcus had been illegally detained while conducting official duties, that the local police department had been notified of the DEA operation, and that arrest of a federal agent was a serious federal matter that went far beyond simple internal affairs review. She asked if Brennan realized that he had literally just handcuffed a federal agent holding valid credentials for the crime of being on a public street. Brennan finally seemed to understand the gravity of what he had done. He said he was just doing his job, responding to a dispatch call. Chen said his job included recognizing legitimate federal identification and making a simple verification call before handcuffing people. Brennan opened the back door of the patrol car and removed the handcuffs from Marcus. Marcus's wrists were red where the metal had pressed against his skin. He got out of the car, recovered his credentials from Brennan, and looked at the young officer with an expression that mixed anger and something close to pity. Marcus said Brennan had just committed one of the most expensive mistakes of his career, that he had arrested a federal agent without cause, interfered with federal investigation, and ignored multiple opportunities to verify information that would have prevented all of this. That if Brennan treated all suspects this way, based on nothing but a neighbor's call about a black man in the neighborhood, then he was a danger to the community. And if he only treated certain types of suspects this way, well then, everyone knew what the real problem was. Marcus, Chen, and Morrison returned to their unmarked surveillance vehicle. Marcus grabbed his phone and immediately called his supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Robert Williams, who oversaw the entire regional DEA operation. The conversation was brief but intense. Marcus reported he'd been detained and handcuffed by a local police officer despite showing valid federal credentials and identifying himself as a DEA agent, that the officer had refused to make simple verification and had chosen to arrest him based on nothing but a call about a suspicious person. Williams said he would initiate protocols immediately, that arrest of a federal agent during official operation was a serious matter requiring notification to multiple agencies, including the Department of Justice, and that Marcus should document everything while it was fresh. The planned narcotics operation had to be postponed. The presence of a police cruiser on the street, the commotion of Marcus's arrest, and the time that had passed meant any suspects in the target house were probably now alert that law enforcement was in the area. Months of investigative work weren't completely ruined, but the element of surprise was definitely compromised. Marcus sat in the unmarked car and began writing a detailed report on his laptop, documenting every aspect of the encounter. The exact time Brennan arrived, the specific words exchanged, how many times Marcus identified himself, the offer to make a verification call, Brennan's refusal to accept that verification, the decision to handcuff. Everything was going into an official report that would be filed with multiple federal agencies. Brennan's body camera video was officially requisitioned within 2 hours. The police department had no choice but to provide it when the demand came from the United States Attorney's Office. The video showed everything. Marcus calmly showing his credentials, Brennan questioning their legitimacy without basis, Marcus offering multiple forms of verification, Brennan refusing all of them. The arrest of a federal agent who was literally holding a gold badge and photo credentials issued by the United States Department of Justice. It was undeniable evidence of an error in judgment so profound it suggested either massive incompetence or racial bias operating at an unconscious or conscious level. The story leaked to media within a day. Investigative reporters began asking questions about why a DEA agent had been arrested in a residential neighborhood. The police department issued a statement saying they were reviewing the incident, that the officer had responded to a suspicious person call, and that they were fully cooperating with any federal investigations. But the statement was met with skepticism, especially when details emerged. Federal agent with 11 years of service, valid credentials shown immediately, offer of verification refused, arrested without cause. The pattern was all too familiar to many people in the DEA community, especially people of color who had experienced being treated as suspects regardless of their credentials or conduct. The DEA issued its own statement, rare for an agency that typically operated discreetly. The statement said, Special Agent Johnson had been conducting an authorized narcotics operation, had properly identified himself to local law enforcement, and had been illegally detained despite showing appropriate federal identification. That the agency was fully cooperating with conduct reviews, but was also considering all legal options available to address what appeared to be clear violation of their agents' rights and interference with federal law enforcement operations. The tone was measured, but the implication was clear. The DEA was taking this extremely seriously, and consequences would come. Investigators began reviewing Brennan's history. He had been with the department for just 18 months, having joined as a rookie officer after completing police academy. In that short time, he had generated an unusually high number of stops and detentions, 23 in total. Of those 23, 17 involved Black or Latino individuals, despite his patrol district being only 40% non-white. He had received 2 previous complaints, both from Black men who alleged Brennan had stopped them without cause and treated them with disrespect. The complaints had been superficially investigated by Brennan's supervisor, who had concluded the officer was just being cautious and following his instincts. No disciplinary action had been taken beyond a verbal conversation about community relations. The internal affairs investigation was launched immediately, but this time under intense federal scrutiny. Representatives from the Department of Justice, the United States Attorney's Office, and the DEA itself were all monitoring the process closely. The police chief knew any appearance of cover-up or protection of Brennan would be disastrous not just for public relations, but potentially for future partnerships with federal law enforcement agencies. Investigators interviewed Brennan extensively. His story kept changing in ways that undermined his credibility. First, he said Marcus's credentials looked fake. When asked what specifically looked fake, he couldn't articulate anything beyond an instinctive feeling. Then, he said, Marcus had been hostile and uncooperative, but body camera video showed Marcus calmly identifying himself and offering verification multiple times. When pressed on why he hadn't simply called the number on Marcus's identification to verify, Brennan said he thought it might be a fake number too, that people involved in elaborate crimes sometimes created fake verification systems. Investigators pointed out he could have called the DEA's main office, that the number was publicly available, or he could have contacted his own dispatcher who had records of the DEA's notification about the operation in the area. Brennan had no good explanation for why he hadn't done any of these things. The truth that was emerging was uncomfortable. Brennan had seen a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, had responded to a call describing a suspicious person, and had decided based on some combination of instinct and prejudice that Marcus was a threat rather than a law enforcement agent. The woman who had made the original suspicious person call was interviewed as well. She was a 58-year-old neighborhood resident who had lived on the street for 23 years. When asked what specifically about Marcus's behavior was suspicious, she said he was looking at houses, that he was standing on the sidewalk for an extended period, and that he didn't belong in the neighborhood. When asked how she knew he didn't belong, she hesitated, and then said she knew most people on the street and didn't recognize him. Investigators asked if she would have made the same call if the person were white. She insisted yes, but her hesitation said otherwise. The pattern was familiar. A black person in a white neighborhood was automatically suspicious, automatically not belonging. Marcus was contacted by multiple civil rights organizations offering support and offering to connect him with lawyers specializing in police misconduct and racial discrimination. He also received a call from an attorney named Jennifer Martinez, who had successfully litigated some of the largest civil rights cases against police departments in the country. Jennifer reviewed all the details of Marcus's case, watched the body camera video multiple times, and said it was one of the clearest examples she had ever seen of racial profiling and illegal detention of a law enforcement agent. She said they should seek not just compensatory damages for violation of his rights, but massive punitive damages that would send a message that interfering with federal operations and arresting agents based on racial prejudice had devastating consequences. The DEA was also considering action. The agency rarely sued local police departments, preferring to work cooperatively. But this case was different. One of their agents had been handcuffed and arrested while conducting official operation despite proper identification. An important narcotics operation had been compromised, and the incident had sent a disturbing message to DEA agents, particularly agents of color, that even with federal credentials and badges, they could be treated like criminals by local law enforcement. The DEA's General Counsel Office was reviewing legal options, including suing both Brennan personally and the police department for interference with federal operations. The potential financial cost began becoming clear as legal analysis progressed. Federal civil rights lawsuits under Section 1983 could result in substantial damages when the violation was this flagrant. Marcus could seek compensatory damages for emotional distress, damage to professional reputation, and compromise of an operation he had worked to build for months. He could seek punitive damages against Brennan personally for conduct that was so outrageous. And the DEA could seek damages for interference with federal operations, for the costs of delaying and potentially having to restructure an important narcotics investigation. Lawyers estimated the total could easily reach 8 figures if the case went to trial and a jury was sympathetic to the federal agent who had been arrested for doing his job. The internal affairs investigation findings were issued 6 weeks after the incident. Brennan was found guilty of multiple serious policy violations, including detention without reasonable probable cause, failure to verify federal identification when presented, interference with federal law enforcement operation, and demonstration of possible racial bias in his actions. The recommendation was immediate termination. Brennan's supervisor, Sergeant Tom Richardson, who had dismissed the 2 previous complaints without proper investigation, received a 30-day suspension without pay and was removed from supervisory position. The department concluded he had failed to identify and address a problematic pattern of behavior that culminated in an incident with federal consequences. Brennan tried to contest the termination through the police union. His attorney argued he had responded to a dispatch call in good faith, that he hadn't been adequately trained on how to verify federal credentials, and that he was doing what he thought was appropriate procedure. But the arbitrator wasn't persuaded. The decision pointed out Brennan had refused multiple offers of verification, that he had ignored valid federal credentials that any reasonably trained officer should recognize, and that his pattern of disproportionate stops suggested underlying bias that informed his actions. The body camera video was undeniable evidence that Marcus had been professional, cooperative, and clearly identified, while Brennan had escalated without justification. The termination was upheld. Jennifer Martinez filed the federal lawsuit 9 months after the incident. The lawsuit was comprehensive and devastating in its scope. It named Brennan personally, Sergeant Richardson for negligent supervision, and the police department and city for failure to adequately train, failure to discipline a pattern of misconduct, and allowing an environment where racial bias could flourish unchecked. The allegations included violation of Marcus's Fourth Amendment rights, false arrest, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation of character, and interference with federal duties. The Section 1983 civil rights claim was central, arguing Marcus had been treated differently specifically because of his race. The amount sought was $10 million in combined compensatory and punitive damages. The complaint included devastating details. It described how Marcus had identified himself multiple times, had shown valid credentials, had offered verification, all captured on video. It described Brennan's pattern of disproportionate stops of people of color. It included testimony from other people Brennan had stopped without cause. It cited academic literature on implicit bias in law enforcement and how it manifested in exactly the type of behavior Brennan had demonstrated. And it included analysis of how the neighbor's original call hadn't described an actual crime, but simply the presence of a black man. Yet Brennan had responded as if a crime were occurring. The city and police department tried to settle quickly. Their lawyers knew they had a losing case. Federal agent with 11 years of experience service, valid credentials ignored, indisputable video showing Marcus's professionalism and Brennan's unjustified escalation, documented pattern of racially disproportionate stops, and massive public sympathy for a federal agent who had been handcuffed for doing his job. The initial offer was $1,200,000. Jennifer rejected it immediately, saying it didn't reflect the severity of the violations or send an adequate message about consequences of interfering with federal operations and arresting agents based on racial prejudice. Negotiations continued for months. The city increased the offer to $2.5 million. Jennifer counteroffered $7.5 million. Depositions were scheduled, including Brennan having to answer questions under oath about his stop history, his decisions that day, and his attitudes about race. The city didn't want those depositions to become public. Experts had been hired by both sides. A psychologist was prepared to testify about the trauma and emotional distress Marcus had experienced. A law enforcement expert was prepared to explain how Brennan's actions violated all standard protocol. A racial bias expert had detailed analysis of Brennan's stop pattern demonstrating statistical disparity that was impossible to explain, except through conscious or unconscious bias. The final settlement was reached 2 weeks before the scheduled trial date. The city agreed to pay $6,500,000 to Marcus. Brennan was personally liable for an additional $1 million to be paid through wage garnishments from any future employment for the rest of his life, his savings already depleted, and sale of assets. Sergeant Richardson was personally liable for $250,000 for negligent supervision. The remainder, $1,250,000, would come from the DEA in a separate lawsuit against the city for interference with federal operations. The combined total of $8 million was one of the largest settlements ever paid in a police misconduct case involving a federal agent. But money was only part of the settlement. The required policy reforms were extensive and binding. Every officer had to complete 60 hours of training on recognizing federal credentials, including practical sessions where they learned to identify badges and identification from DEA, FBI, ATF, and other agencies. Implicit bias training was expanded from 4 to 40 hours annually, with actual competency assessments and consequences for officers who failed to demonstrate appropriate understanding. A comprehensive tracking system was implemented to monitor demographic data on every stop, search, and detention by every officer, with mandatory quarterly review by an independent panel. Most significantly, the settlement required that any officer with a pattern of disproportionate stops, defined as more than 20% above the department average for their district, would automatically be placed in intensive training and close monitoring. Failure to correct the pattern would result in reassignment or termination. The department also had to establish a dedicated hotline for federal agents to report problems with local officers, with mandatory investigation of any complaint of interference with federal operations, and a civilian oversight panel with community-appointed members, including representatives from civil rights organizations, would gain real power to review cases and recommend discipline. Marcus used a substantial portion of his settlement to establish a foundation dedicated to helping law enforcement agents of color who faced discrimination. The Johnson Justice Foundation provided legal assistance, mental health support, and advocacy for federal, state, and local officers who experienced discriminatory treatment from colleagues or other agencies. In the first year, the foundation helped 18 law enforcement agents with cases ranging from workplace harassment to, in one case, another federal agent who had been stopped by a local officer. The foundation also worked with law enforcement academies to develop curriculum on recognizing interagency credentials and respecting officers of all backgrounds. Brennan disappeared from law enforcement permanently. His certification was permanently revoked by the state commission after review of the case. He tried to find work in private security, but the viral video of him handcuffing a federal DEA agent followed him wherever he went. Employers didn't want to hire someone with such demonstrably poor judgment and documented history of racial bias. He ended up working a series of low-wage jobs unrelated to law enforcement, 20% of each paycheck automatically garnished to pay his debt to Marcus. Some acquaintances expressed sympathy, saying one moment's error had destroyed his life. But others pointed out it wasn't one moment, it was an 18-month pattern of disproportionate stops that culminated in arresting a federal agent. The case, Marcus Johnson versus City and Kyle Brennan, became widely cited in law enforcement training courses across the country. Federal academies, including DEA, FBI, and ATF, used it to train new agents on what to do if stopped by local law enforcement, emphasizing importance of clear identification, offering verification, and documentation through recording when possible. Local police departments used it as an example of how not to respond to a person holding federal credentials, emphasizing that a simple verification call could have prevented millions in damages and destruction of an officer's career. Law schools used it in courses on Section 1983 litigation and the intersection of racial bias with interagency law enforcement. The narcotics operation that had been compromised by the incident was eventually resumed 3 months later with revised planning. The DEA arrested 14 people in a series of coordinated raids, seized 60 kilograms of cocaine, and dismantled a distribution network that had been operating for years. Marcus led the operation, his professionalism and dedication unchanged by the humiliation he had suffered. But he never forgot that November morning when he had been handcuffed for doing his job. The experience informed how he interacted with local law enforcement from then on, always ensuring clear communication, always documenting contacts, always aware that his badge and credentials didn't make him immune to prejudice. The body camera video from that morning remained public, archived on multiple servers, embedded in countless training programs. It showed with brutal clarity what racial profiling looked like, even when the victim was an experienced federal agent with valid credentials. It showed how bias could make even a recently trained officer ignored direct evidence in front of him. And it showed why body cameras were crucial for accountability, because without that video, it might have been Marcus's word against Brennan's, complicated by dynamics of federal agent versus local officer. But the video didn't lie. It captured truth in a way that couldn't be denied or revised. Years after the incident, when interviewers asked Marcus how he felt about the entire case, he always gave a carefully considered answer. He said he wished it had never happened, that no one should have to experience the humiliation of being handcuffed for doing their job lawfully. But since it did happen, he was satisfied there was comprehensive accountability, that significant changes were forced, and that his case could serve to educate and prevent similar incidents. That the $8 million in combined settlements wasn't about enriching him, but about putting a price on interfering with federal operations and violating agents' rights based on prejudice that was high enough to make departments rethink how they trained and supervised officers. The neighborhood where it all happened never had a marker or plaque, but residents who knew the story occasionally referenced it when discussing law enforcement and racial bias. Some saw it as a reminder that not even a federal badge made someone immune to being profiled. Others saw it as an example of why documentation and accountability mattered, why people with resources and knowledge of the system had a responsibility to fight not just for themselves, but to establish precedents that would protect others. The neighbor who had made the original call never publicly apologized, but multiple neighbors reported she moved from the neighborhood within a year, unable to face the community ostracism that came from being known as the person whose racially motivated call had triggered a multi-million-dollar incident. Brennan never directly apologized to Marcus. In a rare interview years later, he maintained he had followed his training, that he had responded to a dispatch call appropriately, and that the situation had simply escalated, unfortunately. That inability to acknowledge underlying bias, that refusal to examine his own assumptions about who looked suspicious and who deserved benefit of the doubt, was exactly why systemic reform was necessary. It wasn't enough to punish individual officers. Departments had to actively work to identify and address bias before it led to harm. Brennan's law enforcement career lasted 18 months. In that short time, he had demonstrated a clear pattern of disproportionate stops, had ignored 2 complaints, and finally had handcuffed a federal agent holding valid credentials. It took arresting the wrong person to expose what many in the community already knew, that Brennan saw certain people as automatically suspicious based on nothing but race. And it cost the city and department $8 million, cost Brennan his career and financial future, and cost Marcus Johnson the indignity of being treated like a criminal while doing the work he had dedicated his career to performing. For Marcus, the incident became a defining moment, not because it changed who he was, but because it crystallized what he already knew. That being a federal agent didn't protect him from racial prejudice. The credentials and badges didn't guarantee respect. That the system often protected bad officers until video evidence and public attention made protection impossible. And that real change required not just pursuing individual justice, but using that justice to force reforms that would protect countless others. The $6.5 million settlement, the foundation he established, the policy reforms that were implemented, none of it erased the humiliation of that November morning. But it transformed a moment of injustice into a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes when people with resources and determination demanded accountability, the system could be forced to improve, one devastatingly expensive case at a time.